maybe we should get going. Just for anyone who might be watching live on YouTube, and just to let you know that we are live on YouTube. My name is Pippa Bailey, and Gurkam, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Gurkam Ajarlu, zooming in from Jajawaran country.
And this is a conversation about systems change in the arts, the last in our series, and a conversation to recap what we talked about last week, recap the series, and then focus on some serious action moving forward. And also to thank Louise and Ray, who are live captioning. And of course, thanks to Feral Arts and Arts Front for hosting this. So I thought we could start, and because there's few of us, maybe it would be good to go around and just say who you are and acknowledge where you are, and let's then jump into the conversation, recap the conversation we had last week. Can I throw to you, Nancy? You're on mute.
Hi, I'm Nancy Black. I'm on Wurundjeri country, down in Victoria, and I am the artistic director for a small independent cross art form company called Black Hole Theatre that does a lot of puppetry, but also other stuff.
Beautiful, thank you. And welcome, Katie. Israel, can we throw to you?
Hi, everybody. My name is Israel Aloni. I am zooming in from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, aka Melbourne. I'm an independent contemporary dance artist, writer, and educator. I'm the artistic director of an independent organization called IL Dance, which is based in Gothenburg, Sweden, which used to be my home before I moved to Australia 3 years ago.
Thank you. Vivian, do you want to say hi?
Hi, Vivian Glance over here on the west coast on Wajak country in Perth, also known as Bolu. Mainly writer, theatre performer, but have been involved in activism and campaigning, political campaigning around various things as well. And very much interested in how we move forward.
Beautiful. Thank you for joining so early from Western Australia. And Katie, would you like to?
Hi everyone, my name is Katie Lee. I am a lecturer at Deakin in Creative Arts and Expanded Performance, and my practice is based in installation, performance, video, cross-disciplinary work. Yeah, so I haven't been able to tune in. My apologies for 2 of the sessions. I'm very keen to know what went on, but my schedule didn't allow, so I'm looking forward to today. Thanks, guys.
Beautiful. Well, thanks for joining. I think because there's only the 6 of us online, here in the Zoom, we'll just keep it all together today, and let's just have a free-ranging conversation. We've sort of loosely broken it up into recapping last week, reframing, recapping the series, and then we've got some actions that we've identified as kind of quite clear, but we don't have to stick with them. That's just to give it some structure. And part of that then will lead to how can we have more of these conversations? And because I feel, as we've discussed across the season, this is it's a muscle that needs flexing, and we've only kind of just touched the surface. So if we can go back to last week, we had Dr. Kim Liu and Deborah Hart from Climax and Climb Art and the Climate Guardians. And we talked quite a lot about the ecological emergency and how that relates to the arts. And because, I think it was really interesting because we were recapping the neoliberal conversation at the start of our session, it felt like we spent quite a lot of time talking about it in relation to money. And I think that's quite tricky at the moment because it feels like that's the grand narrative at a government level, is that it's growth and jobs or it's environmental action. And I just wanted to notice that, because I feel like it's a trap we can't get into. And there's certain realities around it because it is part of an ongoing agenda. But I'd just love to hear from others who were there if you've had sort of further thoughts across the week about that conversation.
I think one of the things that really stuck out for me was what Deborah was talking about, the amount of people from the fossil fuels industries that are represented on arts organisations' boards, and the project that they have. I think it was called Mapping. It was a mapping project where they've actually mapped the amount of people that are, and I just, yeah, that was really quite astounding, I think, for me, even though I knew it, but really to actually think about the impact that has on the arts. And some of our breakouts, we were talking about the way that artists can become almost like accessories at balls and lunches that are set up for these these people to sort of perform for them and be the kind of accessory for these people who are on these sorts of in these sorts of industries. So that really stood out for me.
Hi, George, welcome. Because we're quite a small group, we've all done introductions and people have put where they are in the chat, which country they're on. So I don't know if you'd like to just introduce yourself to the group. Oh, we can't hear you, you're on mute.
Hi, sorry, my name's George. I proudly live on Woiwurrung Wurundjeri Kulin Nation land. I work on Bunurong land. I acknowledge the traditional sovereigns of the land, and live in lieu of hope for true justice, that they regain their sovereignty. And I'm an artist. I work in disability arts and filmmaker and other socially engaged platforms.
Beautiful, thank you and welcome. We're just recapping last week's conversation, which was about responding to the ecological emergency. Does anyone else have any?
Am I muted or unmuted?
No, you're unmuted.
Look, I couldn't be there for all of last week's discussion, so I missed the breakout sessions. But one of the things that occurs to me, and it's highlighted by, thank God we have a sane person in the White House again, and his commitment to climate change action, is that we are in this bizarre kind of vortex where there is no easy solution. There are no easy lines that can be drawn about, is it economy or is it climate change? I'm going to be fascinated. I work and live and try my best to do as an individual what I can to reduce my emissions and to take care of the land. But I also know that there are people who don't have the kind of privilege that I do, that enables me to do that. And I think we don't know yet. There's just no easy map out of this conundrum. And it's not always a choice about money or the climate. It's not always that, but sometimes it is. And maybe those of us who are privileged need to step up more. But also there are no easy pathways for that. So, it's kind of typified for me by the argument in Melbourne, I don't know if any of you are aware of this, about taxing electric vehicles on the road and whether that's actually going to make more emissions rather than less. and I have an electric car and I charge off the panels on my roof. But that immediately identifies me as somebody who could afford both of those things. And I totally accept that, but I think it is my responsibility, because I can afford it, to do it. Where my arts practice comes in then into that, I don't know. But anyway, I guess what I'm doing is saying, I think this whole area is important and it's very confusing.
I think what's really useful to notice is because the government has behaved so uncharacteristically over COVID, and basically, I'm no expert, but from my understanding, the principles of modern monetary theory, which Bill Mitchell, who's an academic at the University of Newcastle, has been developing for 30 years. Deborah mentioned him last week. So modern monetary theory is basically, and again, I'm no expert, so you're going to get the layman's version, but it's if a government has control of its own currency, there's an ability to be able to spend, just as our government has just done on JobKeeper and JobSeeker and so on. And where it gets complicated is then it's in its relationships on the international stage and in the international market. Now, I raise that because I think that's enabled conversations about the universal basic income to come to the fore in a way that they hadn't been able to, because suddenly there was an imagination for, oh, actually, the government can do this when it needs to. Now, of course, there's a whole lot of conversation that is about to happen about the debt and what that means for us. But it's sort of playing into the whole idea that we need to change the macroeconomic system. And there are a lot of people working on that. So, of course, it's not for us to all become experts in everything, but it's quite useful just to notice some of those behaviour changes and then go, okay, well, what does it mean for us? And where is the possibility of being able to imagine that if there was a universal basic income for artists, would that then enable a whole bunch of other things to happen? And I was saying before you came on the call, I was in a meeting with elders yesterday on Larrakia country, and they were saying, why aren't elders funded, properly respected as cultural knowledge keepers? And I was like, oh, I don't know if, is that been linked to the universal basic income? What does that look like? And then Norm from Arts Front was telling us about NIACA, which is the National Indigenous Arts and Cultural something. Sorry, I'm not sure what the...
Norm, do you want to speak to that? Is Norm there?
He's hiding.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, sorry, I'll post the link for just if you haven't heard of that before. It doesn't exist yet. It's in development. It's a project that's been led by the community over the, in different forms over the last 20 years or so that we've been aware of, and it's at a stage of pulling together a national gathering of First Nations leaders planned for next year. It'll be the first time in 50 years that's ever happened. That happened just at the same time as the formation of the Australia Council. There was a meeting of First Nations artists back then, and nothing's ever happened since on that scale on a national level. So I'll post the link if you haven't seen it before, and we can discuss.
Thank you. That's brilliant. So again, I'm jumping around a little bit, but we're now in this place where this is about the system. So if rather than there be this polarized conversation between, money versus climate action, we need to be thinking more systemically about how each relates to the other in order to then not get stuck in the binary. And also acknowledging that there are people who don't have any money, and that's a really terrible current situation to be in.
Pippa, can I just ask, there's just, I mean, are you saying that the discussion about climate action and the discussion of a base income, say, are the same conversation? Because
I
I don't see those as exactly the same thing.
I don't either, but I
really
think they're
important.
really related to each other because they relieve the tension of that polarized argument.
Okay.
That you know, as an artist, it came up with one of the examples last week. You know, somebody had been doing an action in Plymouth in New Zealand outside their big new shiny art gallery, and the artists were all saying, we need the space and we need the money that comes with that. And yes, it's fossil fuel driven. So what happens when you relieve the need for that money? I mean, if there is another way, then what does that enable in terms of climate action? I guess that's what I'm saying.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Look, this is a perennial question, because when you start pulling out one of the jack straws, you're going to shift the others. You know, it kind of is like that. The Jenga tower will topple. But it's the whole question for me is that this conversation needs to be an internal conversation for a mapping out of a long-term process, because any of those system changes, people have been talking about UBIs, well-being, budgets, all of these other kind of social changes, alternatives to GDPs, that type of thing for a long time, but we're not actually cracking it very quickly. It is happening in certain places like New Zealand with the well-being budget that they've just started to introduce, and a few other places around the world are looking at these possibilities. I think there's even people around the world who've introduced UBIs, so they're being tested at the moment. But from our position as artists, what I think our task looking outwards is what is the journey we take people on to join us? If we start sort of looking at the destination, then we lose people. And I think it's what is the easiest thing for someone to come on board and join us with? And that easiest thing for me is we don't give the social license to the fossil fuel companies through our art. And that to me is the easiest step, and the one that I found just talking to people anecdotally is the one they're most willing to jump on with, because they can see the alternative. They can see the second step, which is, okay, so either we need to lobby government for better funding of the arts, potentially, if we get a Labour government, that's going to be possible, or we work with existing systems and existing structures to find alternative sponsors who have an ethical position. So that's the easy step. And once you've got them on board, then you start on the third step, which is, okay, what are the system changes? And it's this step by step, and it's the ladder of engagement. It's a very common activist model. I think Common Cause were one of those. If you want to look up Common Cause Foundation, they've got amazing resources. And it's this step by step by step approach of getting people to join, to then become educated, to then become advocates, and then activists. So, you know, I love these conversations, the blue sky thinking about what an ideal world would be. And, you know, even with something like UBI, there is the other side of the coin. One could offer UBI, and then from a neoliberal perspective, I noticed that certain neoliberal people are looking at UBIs because they will say, okay, you've got enough money to live on. You pay for all your healthcare, all of your housing, all of your education from the UBI. And if you want to go and earn extra money, that's fine. You can buy a better house and a better school. And so there is a trap there to think that something is the answer to everything, because we go back to an ideology. Everything can be twisted around.
Sure. No, I mean, I totally take that point. I guess part of the reason for hosting this series in the first place was that I think Gurkham and I recognized that there was a lack of engagement of artists in the blue sky thinking. I think there's a lot of people on the journey, and in many ways, in terms of environmental activism, the arts are a bit behind. There's because, and for, you know, for all the reasons. So it's really that power of imagination. How do we imagine better? And what does that look and feel like, which will help with the incremental steps to get them onto, you know, specific campaigns. I guess that's.
I see. So in a sense, you feel like the arts have been self-censoring because of our obligations to the fossil fuel companies. Is that what we're thinking?
Well, if you listen to Deb last week, yes, absolutely. I mean, that's her position, that it's because of the board relationships and the power within organisations. I don't think it's quite so clear cut. And I also want to recognise, as I've said before, there's so many artists who are doing incredible work in this space. It's not to, you know.
Yeah, I think it's the problem of, it's not so much that artists aren't being activists, it's that artists aren't in the room. Artists aren't, artists, and you know, that comes back to a whole lot of structural issues with the arts. And, you know, the infantilization of artists, some of the things we've discussed about, you know, the way that our organizations are now structured so that artists have very little connection with the producers and the administrators and the managers that are running, you know, the sector. So I think that part of the problem that Pippa and I were talking about is how to re-empower artists to be able to be in the room and to, you know, it's not that artists aren't doing things because they are, but it's just that there's a disconnect. So yeah, that's also part of it.
There's also an issue about, or there's a counter argument perhaps, that by getting the big corporate people in on your boards, if they're there, could I just say that small to medium sectors don't usually attract major corporate people onto their boards? The thought of having an oil person on the board, oh my God. Anyway, then no one would come near it. But one of the things is that you can educate them about their role and about what they're doing and their policies. Another thing that is, and it comes down, you know, it's about the money thing too, is that boards have to be responsible for the financial well-being of whatever company it is they're sitting on. That's their legal responsibility. And one of their ways of ensuring ongoing finance is that they get people who have access to money, not just government. And the government says you have to be viable as well as accepting money from us. So there are issues here. Can we educate those people? Should they be on boards? A lot of artists that I know don't want to go near a board meeting because it's so boring. It's all about governance. And it's about, you know, budgets and yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question and probably comes back to that, you know, thinking of different structures and so on. I mean, it's an interesting question. I think, you know, boards are one of the structures, I suppose. But it sort of comes back to that thing that I was just saying before, the infantilization of artists, that artists are seen as, you know, children playing in sandpits. They don't, I mean, sure, a lot of artists don't want to be on boards, but you know, there are a whole lot of other kind of angles to the sector where we can see that artists are not in the room, in the discussions that are really actually critical. I think, Israel, you had your hand up. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just have a few things. It might be a little bit scattered, but I'll try to adhere it into one cohesive thing. So a little bit segueing and then I'll return. Last week, or actually in the beginning of this week, there was a shark attack somewhere in Australia. And as we all know, what happens when there's a shark attack, the beach is closed, and then, you know, helicopters go up to shoot some sharks. It really made me think a lot about how we live in a context that actually allows something like this to happen. And it kind of reinforces this idea of the separation between human and nature, human and reality, actually. And I was just thinking that where humans would murder sharks for swimming in the ocean, humans will murder humans for walking on land. And it made me think about the history of Australia. And I think that there's something with how we are trying to structure a certain reality that maybe has some denial and some trauma for the past that doesn't allow us to connect with the human aspect of being human. And I think that in at least performing arts, in live performing arts, what we do is that we actually reinforce our humanity by doing the work. And as an artist, I felt like I wanted to flag that what needs to happen is that the artists will be allowed to make art and not have to be paying any debts to advocacy, to politics, to everything else. I think this is the managers, the producers, the presenters. This is their job, your job, if you are associating as one of these. And artists need to make art because art is actually one of the only resources that we have to actually fight post-humanism, to fight this, you know, transition into cyborg, to fight not realizing anymore that any ecological, any environmental disruption is actually a human disruption. And I think that it's important that artists and the making of art will be earning the value and the importance and the credit that it deserves. I don't think that artists need to be pushed time and time again to take the responsibility. I think that where the situation is such that boards are tied with corporate money and they cannot actually decide whether or not to go forth with a certain project because of where the money comes from. I believe that this is not where art is being made. This is where entertainment is being made. This is where agenda is being reinforced. This is where politics are being played out. But this is not art. And I think it's important to make that distinction. The people who are really struggling to make art that reminds ourselves of what it means to be human and what it means to be human in a larger context and seeing the meta context and connecting to nature and connecting to other humans, which also goes back into discrimination and racism and xenophobia and misogyny and so on and so forth. I would just like to suggest that maybe we can make that distinction.
Vivian?
Yeah, look, I think I absolutely agree. I loved your statement. If you're separate from nature, you're separate from reality. I think that's very profound. And it's, you know, this is something that is part of the higher level up the ladder kind of thinking too, because we need to get people along that and change their thinking of arts as an industry. And we've had 30 years of being told now that we are an industry, that we're not for social good. It's the same thing they're trying to do for the health service. This health service used to be for social good and was collectively paid for. We're now being told it's an industry and has to make a profit. So it's this whole rejection of that neoliberal thinking of everything has a price. And to change the way people see art as a social good is, to me, is the ultimate aim of what I want to do. And there's nothing to, you know, I'm putting on my sort of neoliberal fascist hat here to say there's nothing to stop you making art if you want to make art. Off you go and make your own art, but don't expect me to pay for it. That's the way they think. And as long as we exist in our creative space with a shell of corporatization, such as governance, such as infrastructure that needs to be paid for, such as hospitality that is feeding off of this, that pays for a lot of things, you know, this kind of things, the whole range. I mean, you look at things like impact reports from arts organisations. I was looking at the Fringe one from last year over here in WA, The impact report is about how many more people bought drinks and food in the local area, how many more parking tickets were paid for. And that's why they want Fringe, because it pushes up their GDP. And that's the only reason. So how we get ourselves out of that space is the big question, and into a space of public good and social well-being, and arts as part of who we are and how we live, rather than this kind of separate thing. To me, that's the big question. And, you know, I would love to be valued for what I do just because of what I do. And for it to be, you know, I work with people from other communities, and there's a very good friend of mine from the Sudanese community. And when they get together, the art comes out of the community. It's not something that they're given and they passively accept. It's part of who they are. You know, it's part of their dancing together. It's part of the music they make together. It's part of the poetry they say to one another. And it's a different way of receiving art, which is rather, at the moment it's transactional. I'll stop there.
Can I just add a slightly different view to Israel's? And again, I don't want to speak for any First Nations people, and my experience of working with them, different people, is that there's also something about the siloed separation of art from other parts of life that is not their experience of art and culture. It's absolutely integrated. And so just as we've siloed off, you know, different sectors, health, you know, corporate, whatever, in this systems change conversation, I would like to think that there's a way of also breaking down the silo into the arts. And yes, of course, to value and enable artists to practice. I totally hear what you're saying about that. And how do we all participate as citizens in the change that we want to see? Artist, health worker, corporate worker, whatever.
I wonder about sorry, Nancy, you want to say something?
You're on mute.
No, I jiggled. A couple of things. One, I'm wondering if there is a country that we know of who, it may be Belgium or Germany or one of those countries, where art is recognized and valued and therefore supported, and artists are supported and they don't have to keep defending themselves for being an artist. And I'm also wondering, casting back, because I mean, I think in mankind's history that art was always there, storytelling, painting. It was part of our lives. It was a part of way that you made sense of the world. But then we got into that weird thing between craft and art. And that's, I don't know, Vivian, I have a feeling that's not going, that little distinction, which is horrible in so many ways. I don't know if we're going to easily get away from that. I don't know what to do about this. But my first question is there a model around the world? Does anybody know a country where people are artists?
I don't have figures, but I do. My understanding is that in Germany, they have a much higher percentage of taxpayer dollars spent on arts funding than we do. Basically, it's a government-led thing supported by the community. If you go to Germany, you'll find that even smallish towns will have a magnificent theatre that has a regular program.
They have opera companies.
Yep. Yeah. And
I'm not sure what we need,
but it's much higher than over here.
I would just be cautious about going and following Europe, given the history.
But
That's
is
why
the model for supporting art.
Yeah, and I guess I guess because of the climate emergency, I feel like there's this opportunity to be actually shifting it in a much more dramatic way than that. And we have to imagine it first, back to Vivian's point.
Do you have a picture of that, Pippa?
Well, I mean, the more I'm working with Indigenous people, the more I think actually they know. They actually do know. And that's part of the First Nations First conversation is how do we empower that and then follow the lead? And no, I don't know what it looks like, but then I'm also an artist in my background. And so I don't mind not knowing. I just, you know, like you do when you're in a creative process, you start having a sense of something and then you start pulling, you know, making strange connections and starting to see something else emerge. And I feel like that's why I want more artists in this space, because I really feel like that's the opportunity right now. We need that ability, those processes to be helping others, because I am in a lot of different conversations in different sectors about systems change, and it doesn't have that. And that to me is, and you know, I know a lot of artists don't want to do that. They just want to make their work. But for those who are interested, I think there's an incredible opportunity.
Israel, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I'm actually just responding to the comment about Germany. Yes, Germany has in every city a theater, an opera, and a dance company that is actually leftovers from the socialism of Germany. You can also see it in other socialistic or even Soviet Union. You go to Armenia, every city has a theater. So that's also a leftover of completely different ideology. Another thing about Germany, I lived in Germany for a couple of years and worked in Germany. Another thing is that in Berlin, for example, there's 1,000 cultural and arts activities that one can choose from every single day in Berlin. Anything from movies to galleries to performances to concerts and so on and so forth, 1,000. And yes, the government in in Germany gave independent artists 5,000 euro within days from when they announced the lockdown. They had it in their bank account within days, cash. So save yourself, protect yourself, because we need you. That was the message. We will take care of you. And I think that that's an ideology thing that needs to potentially change, which actually connects to what Noor mentioned. And one of the problems is being the undervaluing of the thinking and knowledge created by artists. So in a way, it has to do with shifting paradigms. Someone mentioned, I think Gerke mentioned, having artists present, and now people also mention it. And I think this week I heard a few times people say that even when they're invited to be sitting around the table, they're not heard and they're not seen. And again, I had this really reflective week today as I'm learning more about the history of Australia. And I was just thinking about the terra nullius and how even when people are there, they're not seen. And I think that there's something that is profound that needs to be remembered and maybe addressed. And it's not just about inviting the people, it's also inviting yourself to listen to the people that you are inviting. Because as we know, tokenism is very, very common nowadays. And diversity and inclusion and listening and opening and broadening and so on and so forth, all the trendy words. But how do we actually do it in practice? And I think that maybe one of the things that we can do, which is a little bit like being an independent artist, is actually let the work do the work. Just start with ourselves and think about what do we do on a daily basis that can make really tiny changes. And I am a great believer in the butterfly effect. And I think that there's this contamination, as we witnessed with the COVID, that can happen very quickly. So it needs to start maybe very, very small. Maybe our attempt to change the paradigm before we change our behavior is what kind of blocks us from actually bringing the change.
Yeah. Thanks, Israel. Norm's put into the chat, one of the opportunities is for the arts to actively reposition itself through leadership in broader cultural and political debates about the future of Australia and the globe. What if artists led a conversation on something like establishing a Bill of Rights for Australia, underpinned by First Peoples First, climate justice, equity, etc.? Would this kind of action shift the status of arts and artists and improve things for us financially? Did you want to speak to that, Norm? I mean, part of what I think you're both saying, it's, to me, it is about being in a position of empowerment. And so perhaps the artists empowered, it's maybe, I mean, I think enabling that, artists that are empowered, enabling other artists to be empowered. Did you want to speak to that, Norm, to your comment?
Only to, so our experience has been, it's difficult terrain when we get the, I guess, financial realities for arts and artists intertwined with the things we want to do strategically. And it becomes hard to separate priorities and identify actions that work. And so our suggestion here is just to say, well, what if we trust ourselves and the value of the thinking and the work and the analysis as a group of people? And so let's not concern ourselves so much with the advocacy around funding and things like that. There's a lot of that going on. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. But what if we start to, as a group, really value the thinking and intellectual capacity of the group of artists who are here and others in the Arts Front Network and other places to take on things that are about leadership in the broader cultural fabric. And so no one else seems to be doing that in a coherent way. And so that could be a contribution that we can, be seen to, be part of leading. And then there's a flow-on effect. There's a support for an understanding, a shift in people's understanding of why you have investment in arts and culture, not just limited to shows and not and gets you out of all the kind of self-defeating arguments about why the arts is important to fund and things like that.
Yeah, it just reminds me of your last comment there. A friend started a brilliant campaign about a year before COVID called Ban Art. And it really, just putting all these sort of posters around saying ban art just made you think, what would happen? I mean, really, ban art. Like, what would happen? Imagine a world where we've banned art. Yeah.
And that also reminds me of, who was it? I think it was David Pledger again, who wanted an artist strike. He was really campaigning for that a couple of years ago. What would it mean if we actually just didn't show up to work? So I think that's sort of in the zeitgeist too of what the value is. And Norm.
I'll just add one other thing. One of the things that we are currently working on that's kind of along these lines in a sense is, we're looking at some opportunities to make connections politically stronger connections politically between, say, the area of public broadcasting, of journalism, independent journalism, of research, independent research, because our sense is that these are all areas that are in different ways undervalued or under attack under the current government in Australia and in other countries. And what seems to us to be the common thing for those different areas is that they really require independence to function properly. So artists need independent capacity to make good art, as researchers and journalists and public broadcasters do. So we're looking at ways to kind of, amplify a conversation about independence that says, well, what's the problem that this government has and with other people have with the idea of independence? What are the structures and institutions that we need in place to properly support independence? And obviously the Australia Council comes clearly into view there. But if you look at, for instance, someone like Ida Buttrose, who's been roundly criticised for her lack of advocacy around funding for the ABC, she's been really clear and strong around journalistic independence. So we could create potentially alliances with key people like her to advocate for that in a block. to the current government and say, okay, these are things that we need to kind of push forward and focus on that, and building the understanding of a topic like that in the public, so that, you know, as you go forward to the next budget, the next election, there's a framework that operates that's not about increasing funding to the arts. It's about putting in place the structures that create the sort of future that we want as a group of people, whatever we decide to do, that is underpinned by values like independence.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I think there's a bigger question within that, which is around the fact that if you look at any of those structures, there are systemic problems and they're similar. So whether it's universities and research, or whether it's the Australia Council, or whether it's the media, there's structural racism, and it's widely discussed. So I guess in that opportunity, how do we also put some different principles into the work that will then take it forward? And I guess that's the bit that I want more conversation about, because I feel like because everything's under attack, we end up defending the very thing that lots of people have said it's got to change. And so and that's why this conversation about systems change is exciting, I think. And yet you don't want to just break everything. Viv.
I don't know if any of you follow the Australia Institute, but I decided that I needed to know what economics was about. And the thing about the Australia Institute is they tell it like it is. They're no bullshit kind of organisation, and they say what they say, and they deconstruct what it is. I'm wondering if through Arts Front, we can model a similar thing, in that they have positioned themselves to be the public voice of what economics is about. Why not here? Because when it comes to art, we know what we do, but does the public? We know why we do it. We know the value of what we do because we receive the responses from our audiences, etc. But what is there around that we can perhaps become the people who write the articles in The Guardian and The Conversation and other places like that, the people who are invited to sit on Q&A or to speak on Radio National Breakfast around the arts, whatever. It needs to, and that will take training, and that will take consensus building around the conversation that we have. And then the thing the Australia Institute started doing now is webinars on what economics is, Economics 101. I mean, similar thing. What people think about art. I mean, I know I've done some workshops in poetry around schools, and basically it's very, very limited as to what the conversation is. So, you know, I'm just throwing that out there as a model.
Yeah, I was just going to actually ask Katie, because you're in a university setting, and education, you know, we've all mentioned it a few times now, its role. And, you know, what did you have any thoughts, Katie, in terms of what university or the education sector can contribute? Sure.
I mean, I think the positive news is that it's become part of the conversation, and especially decolonising the curriculum. There is this schism, or I can observe, I've just been listening to everybody's amazing points of view, and I'm sitting, you know, amongst that thinking, well, my perspective is a little bit like Israel's. I think artists need to practice through their work, and that taking responsibility for your own kind of practice and messaging is what we should do. That argument, when it goes into education space, is interesting because there's a line between what we're sort of authorised to speak about, or what's our knowledge to share, and also then what should be resourced for other people to deliver themselves. So, for example, with Indigenous content or Indigenous knowledges within the institution, Indigenous academics are saying why necessarily should you have to teach that? I wouldn't be able to Japaneseize the curriculum. Why should you indigenize the curriculum? That's some perspectives on that. Whereas from my perspective, I think I need to take on that knowledge, and I want to do that myself as well. So I guess the same sort of spectrum exists within the academy. I guess from my perspective with slow change, I think the positive thing is that it's definitely part of the conversation, like almost daily now, which can only be a positive thing. It's just, again, who resources this stuff. And I think that that's something that just takes time to massage out and to keep speaking up and asking for those resources to be allocated to sort of have Indigenous curriculum developers, not necessarily to put it back onto staff, because there's lots of diversity in this. There should be, we hope, lots of diversity in the staff as well. We're not all Australians ourselves. So there's a sort of, I guess, an awareness that that needs to be funded as well, that development, not just kind of instantly developed as an individual perspective. So, yeah, and I guess from an artist's point of view, I'm kind of asking the same questions, like, as much as I want government funding for every single thing that I absolutely ever do, I also don't, you know, because I think Australia is kind of in a growth, we're suppressed in a way by our scale, because we have this, you know, we're constantly wanting government to fund what we do. But I think that that's quite infantile or infantilizing as well, in a way, to sort of constantly want, I mean, who are they? What's their agenda? You know, like, I don't know how to reconcile that either. And so my strategies within my own practice for that have been to sort of try and turn my back a little bit on those models and to do things in my community that are important to me, that integrate art practice with life in a different way, which I think, you know, is what I do learn from my Indigenous colleagues as well, to not think of art as a product as much as it is a way of living. And I see artists can be the worst enemies to themselves, where no matter how much fantastic work they've done, how many communities they're part of, they still want sales in the galleries. And if you think about who buys artworks, it's just a horrible sort of small select group of, you know, people. So it's a small pool here, and it sort of seems like, to scale that, we need to look in, we need to look at what we want in our communities, we need to look at what we want to show up to, what makes us feel excited and connected. And when I teach, that's not about the product, that's about the process so much of the time, you know. And yeah, so that's where I'm sitting across that space. It's a lot, but I'm very much enjoying it. And I do really appreciate the other perspective. I do appreciate if we hold more accountability to, I mean, I think that what you've said, Vivian, is really inspiring. I'd love to see artists on those panels and cultural knowledge holders to be in the room. I think that's really would be an amazing world. I guess I've kind of got this Gen X side of me that just is like, well, fuck you, I'll do it anyway, kind of, you know. If there's no gallery to show in, I'll make the work in the streets. Like, you know, there's that sort of aspect to how I've approached it. But, you know, I think, you know, maybe somewhere in between would be a better option.
Yeah. Thanks, Katie. We've got Nancy's just made a comment earlier about strengthening our connections with our diverse and varied communities to ignite their support for the arts, to recognise the distinctions and complexities we're discussing here. And it's sort of, I think, is in line with Pippa's comment about the arts have become a place for those who can afford to practice for audiences, who can afford to engage. And she's said that she's working across sectors to address the growing disadvantage in Australia, and there's a big gap between them. I just wanted to comment on that because I've been working quite a lot with arts organisations in Victoria to provide consultation to assist them to become more diverse, and diversity being categorised as culturally and linguistically diverse First Nations people and people with disabilities. And I have to say, you know, there's a lot of goodwill out there. There's a lot of organisations that want to reach out, but the lack of diversity is glaring, shall we say, glaringly obvious. within those organisations. So just to those two comments, I think it's quite hard for the arts to embrace, you know, those communities that you just mentioned, Nancy, or to reach out when the organisations themselves, when the sector itself is so incredibly monocultural, and can't even embrace accurately or confidently artists from non-Anglo backgrounds, or people that, you know, or non-ableist backgrounds. It's kind of, I think that's actually the point that first needs to be looked at before we can reach out, because the we needs to become a bit more expanded. And there's another comment here, which is on another point from Ray. Look at the Australian sporting industry that's much more economically secure than the arts. Australian sport and the culture around it is pushed onto children all throughout school and media. Sport is such a big part of the school education system, for example. People seem to think the sports sector has grown to a place of economic security organically because we've demanded it and the market has rewarded the sporting sector, whereas the arts hasn't. I wonder how the arts sector would perform in the market if the arts were ingrained in the school education and media as much as sport. I mean, that's, yeah, we often use that analogy, but really isn't it glaringly obvious again that the difference between sport and Australian culture is the value. It's the value, isn't it? Isn't that the reason that...
It isn't what Ray's saying, that value is taught and encouraged? Because as an ex-high school teacher myself, I think one of the things that I think high school art should teach is a love of art and a you know, a love of other people's work. But instead it sort of becomes this kind of fork in the road where you either make it yourself or you do something else, and that you don't get encouraged to sort of enjoy it and become, you know, a cultural you know, consumer in a way, which is not a very nice word, but you know what I mean. I'm thinking more of consuming as in eating rather than consuming as in buying. But, you know, to sort of to imbue that, I think, and I think, you know, that's what Ray's point, I think, articulates. Like, imagine if I came in again to schools and went, come on, you know, everybody, you know, not just like, oh, you're very good at that and now you can go do top arts, and, you know, and that's something we kind of almost have to uningrain first year uni students with, is exceptionalism and this kind of idea that if you know, beautifully annotate your visual diaries, then someone will discover that you're amazing or something, you know, I don't know, like there's a sort of, that's taught at high school, and it's very rigid the way art's taught at high school. I think going back to that would be an amazing place to start, actually.
I think we've got to be careful about sports, really, seriously. I mean, suggesting that we can be like them is tricky, because sport is embedded in so many other things. I mean, the obvious one, as I pointed in the chat box, is the gambling industry. And the other thing about sports is it's team-based, it's competitive. It is about, it's oppositional. It's about barracking for one side over the other. It pulls in an emotional engagement that is so different from the arts. And it's quite a different concept. Now, the value of sport also is that it's very obviously health benefits, physical health benefits. The value of the arts, I'm sure, is emotional and mental health benefits too, and community benefits and social benefits. But sport is much more tangible. It's much more commercialized. It's much more easy to fit it within a neoliberal economic model in the way that
the principles are the same.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the critical bit. And it's back to, how do we articulate the values that are different from that are about expression, that are about, you know, spiritual connection, that is about connection to environment, and then you start to look at that. And I go back to First Nations, because it's all there. That is exactly what they articulate.
And people will look at sport and say, how can I make a buck out of this? But do they say that with art? You know, and are we prepared to go down that path? I mean, that's the path we're kind of resisting, isn't it?
Well, but haven't they already done that? Like, isn't that, I mean, there's an art world that's very economized,
There is.
you know?
Yeah.
So I don't see it as different. I see every point that you've made as,
in the
I just see every point that you've made as being exactly equivalent in the arts world. I see that as being a corporate space equally and all those things. I can't really see any difference in a way.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. It is that we're trying to move away from that.
Right.
And you know, but at the same time, you can't say we want to be like sport.
I think the main point, though, about being like sport, it's not so much about being like sport. It's more about the level of value that Australian culture has for sport, and to imagine what that would be, what an Australia would be like if the arts had that same level of value. So it's not so. I don't think there's any other point really to replicate other than value.
Myself, many times I've thought, okay, I listen to sometimes news radio where every 30 minutes they have a sports bulletin. Okay, and it can be from anybody's crutch injury right through to who's just won the cup. You know, it can be anything like that. Now, how would you do this? The reason that that's done is because it keeps the audience, and it's done there because people are waiting to hear the latest updates. We can't. How do we do that in the arts? You know, do we say, "Oh, we've just had such and such has been cast in a major movie over here," or "Oh, you know, there's somebody's nearly ending a new painting." How do we? It doesn't sort of have that same impact, because within this system we've created, it's built on spectatorship. It's built on, you know, society of the spectacle kind of stuff, Guy Debord stuff. It's that sort of, how do you capture people's attention and shift them where you want to go? And it, in a way, we've not done that in the arts. And I'm not saying we can't do it, but do we want to do it?
I think it's like, sports go very well hand in hand with neoliberalism and capitalism, because it actually objectifies the goal, and it's about winning. It's about the competition. It's about an external sort of achievement that doesn't require much reflection on the self. And like I said, actually doesn't require a lot of reflection on what it means to be human, because it's kind of an objective goal that one needs to reach. And then it goes into nationalism and winning and representing, and it goes into identity politics. Sports is actually, if anything, the gradual murder of humanity, because it actually gives us this idea of whether you're good at sports, you're actually a good person or you're a good human. And it goes back to the Olympics and why Olympics was actually created. To celebrate the humankind, and it very quickly became to compete one human against the other. And going back to Germany, actually Germany never excelled in sports, because maybe they spend their time and money on the arts. And what it means, and I think the point of going back to school, I think is very important for all of us to remember that the things we're speaking about actually have to do with ideology, have to do with modes of being, has to do with the world. So when we do have the opportunity, when we do have the chance to actually speak or connect in some way with young people, we have to understand that what we're transmitting is not just the piece, it's not just that particular performance, is actually the ideology. Is opening up, is creating room, is expanding the universe in a way to welcome this kind of being, this kind of thinking, this kind of reflecting, with the hopes, like I said, with a butterfly effect, that would give them enough, you know, sort of summon to follow, and you know, they met someone who has already done it, so maybe they can also do it. Unlike the sports, like Vivian said, that it's in their face every half an hour on TV.
We've got about 25 minutes left. It would be good for us now to maybe focus the conversation around actions. Pippa and I, and we've been talking about actions, we've mentioned actions, but also next steps. So Pippa and I have summarized a few of the actions that have come out of the last few weeks, and that we've been talking about now as well. I'll just sort of mention these. So the first one, support and prioritize First Nations artists and agendas and follow their lead. And also as non-First Nations people, to decolonize ourselves and get out of the way. And then a second action, artists being integrated into other power structures, playing with governance structures. Thirdly, exposing and contesting neoliberalism, becoming aware of the structures, becoming aware of the way that artists are starved and then told that they're the most important thing, or this infantilization of artists, becoming more aware and helping more people in the industry, in the sector, to understand this. A practical application of this might be something that Nancy and I mentioned last week about a resource that supports a number of arts organisations or artists, an infrastructural resource that's shared to move away from the top-heavy administration of organisations, and where artists are in the position of actually arranging the producing and the managing rather than being produced and managed, so that their role is actually at the, they have a critical role in that. And then lastly, an artist-led transition. Pippa, did you want to talk to the artist-led transition?
I think actually Vivian raised it and I was just kind of building on it, but I would love to think about how we could do that, what that would look like. And yes, some of the steps that you've talked about, Vivian, in terms of uncoupling from fossil fuel, but I would quite like to be bigger than that. Just to see, because that transition piece hasn't been worked on, it would be really fantastic to then work out who else should be invited into that, and what might that look like.
Any comments or thoughts from anyone about those actions that we mentioned, adding to them, furthering them, or any others that people want to talk about? George, yeah.
I'm always sort of skeptical about the word transition, in that, if like the word co-option sort of blends in with that sometimes, and I wonder, not that we don't want to transition and shift into something else, but I wonder if we think of it, I wonder if we imagine it, what it means to imagine it as a preparedness for a paradigm shift, as opposed to a transition into something that is kind of imaginable in a way, and I guess in a way, if the confusion somehow, if we can embrace the confusion and the not knowing, and have the core principles like, for First Nations leadership, neoliberalism, destruction, or whatever it is that we want, and just sort of work what that means and what that looks like, and how that affects how we embody the future. In that, like if we embrace the unknown in a way and just prepare for something that's coming, that we, not in a kind of blind faith kind of way, but in a way that it, embodies knowledge of preparedness for something else. And I guess how I could see that, how a behavior or a conversation that could be had to help artists prepare for that conversation is maybe having more sort of mutually deep listening discussions with other forms of resistance, other organizations of resistance, environmental groups and all the different perspectives, maybe even, conversations with the sort of more fascist invited groups, or conversations with, health and just different perspectives, but really have a deep listening conversation with people who are actively sort of resisting globally, and that might help sort of dig out some matter to help us prepare, and maybe even be more comfortable with the confusion.
I mean, there's already some groups that are aligning themselves within these alternative spaces and these alternative activist spaces. There's it's mainly the ones I know about are in the UK, I would say, and are either involved in the fossil fuel out of the arts movement or in Exile. So there's Exile Writers, which has recently done a big action outside Tufton Street, which was the some policy institute there that was peddling climate denial, and it had kind of key artists, key writers there occupying that space there. And there's other actions that they're continuing on, using art within the activist space much more, particularly writing. And then there's other, there's other artists who have become activists Again, I'm mainly talking about the fossil fuel transition kind of thing, where BP or not BP, culture declares emergency, art not oil, all of these kind of activism, people who go into the foyers of art galleries and pour oil onto the floor and do a creative intervention in that sort of space. So those are parts, those are sites of not only action, but practice and education. And so that's the kind of way that one could do that. But you're talking, it sounded like you were talking a little more broadly as well. I mean, obviously I'm very focused on what I'm dealing with at the moment, but the broader concept of arts in society and connecting with a broad range of activist or community groups. Is that right, George?
I'm thinking of a movement, an Ecuadorian environmental movement at the moment, which is, for instance, which is, you know, that they work on the rights of nature, and the whole philosophical movement. There's a whole philosophy around that particular form of resistance that is, you know, not human centric, you know, which is a kind of earth centric, scientific, science centric philosophy. And, you know, just those kinds of conversations, I think, and those kinds of deep listening interactions, and particularly around Indigenous, you know, I mean, we have a wealth here of, you know, one of the world's strongest resistance movements. I guess what I'm getting at is, you know, like there's philosophical underpinnings that maybe we could learn and we could embrace before we decide on a kind of model of to transition to, or a kind of model. Yeah, I guess underpinning what I'm saying is that we look for philosophical look for more to become sort of stronger, more prepared citizens for the future, as opposed to co-opt a kind of global, human-centric, globalized neo or sort of soft version of neo-capitalism, unwillingly or unknowingly, because we are artists. We're not really a governance-oriented, or, you know, we're not connected with each other by, we're not a political party or anything like that. And I just think that there's always the kind of balance between transitioning to something worse than we've got with the good intentions that we have.
Yeah, so it's almost like there's two levels that we're talking about, isn't there? There's the personal, what one can personally do in their own paradigm shift, in a way. Is that what you're saying, George? And then there's also the actions that people can take, which might be more along the lines of joining with others. And we've got a whole range of things being put in the chat now, of links from Vivian and from Norm. And also this platform, Arts Front, that we're on right now. Norm, do you want to just speak to some of the points you're putting in the chat there about what Arts Front's doing?
Yeah, look, it aligns really strongly with, so these conversations are coming up in lots of different guises across Australia over the last 3 or 4 years, you know, and the three things that have come out clearly is distilled of First People's First, artist-centered, artist-led, and local action, global connection. And so the way we're approaching trying to support both that local action and global connection and sort of the individual versus the kind of systemic stuff is it's really kind of starting to align much more with individuals and kind of the things that individuals do in their day-to-day life, that kind of be living the change in a sense. And one of the pieces of work we're currently doing is kind of, as we say, aligning with some of the Sdg goals, so that some of the actions that people are currently delivering in their work, whether it be you know practical things that we're doing to reduce our our climate impact or carbon footprint, can be reported in a way that goes straight to those UN bodies. So as a group of artists, we can say, look, here are things that we did together that contribute to, say, climate goal number 5 or something similar like that, and here they are packaged up, delivered, and Arts Front has applied to become, I can't remember Elliot, you might be able to remember the name of the term, but it's an affiliate organisation of the UN. So it means that you get the capacity to have that kind of, you represent in the meeting processes and you can kind of report to that group. So we're trying to, you know, shoot past the national structures that are in place at the moment to connect with other people internationally and sort of see, explore the whole space of people kind of acting locally, but also being in a framework that connects us in a positive way. There's obviously a lot of, you know, contention around the SDGs and different rights agreements, and that's, you know, completely as it should be. But, you know, they're not being put forward as an ideal or anything like that. It's just a way to have a proper conversation about something that's tangible, that is meaningful for all of us, and, you know, and some sort of reference point for what sort of future we might want. We're a signatory as a country to a whole stack of things that we simply don't meet in terms of obligations, and simply by showing through the work that we do as artists that we're actually meeting some of those obligations. Gender equity in pay is like a really great example, I think, where the arts sector can be aggregating the things that we do in a positive space, and that sharing that out and then making that available to other people in the community. So here's an example of stuff that we're already doing that's great, and then so new things that we can do to kind of move that forward would be really cool.
So what I'm just thinking is, I mean, there's so much that's already being done in so many small pockets around all over the place. You know, how do we draw this all together? How do we join the dots and form it into a more cohesive movement? How do we empower ourselves to be not sporadic small groups in different, you know, disjointed spots across this broad country? How do we do that? Do we need to do that? Can we do that? Let's do it.
I think it's completely feasible for us to connect in a proper way and just see the things that, both the things that we're currently doing that are really, there's some obviously amazing stuff that people currently do, and just being able to see and aggregate that is really powerful. But then once you're connected, you know, as a group of people, we could come up with some really great stuff that we decide to do as a group. But, you know, kind of, we're kind of thinking, if you use the things we currently do as like a way of forming the connections, that can be, you know, a way to move forward.
I can see an opportunity to amplify both the idea of Arts Front as the coalescence point of discussions around arts and around improving or changing or flipping or whatever words we want to say where we go. And what I think would be a possibility to do that is this, you know, I always think that it's kind of like a green tick, a badge of recognition, a sort of vegetarian label on a piece of, on a product. We have to find a way to encourage people who, basically it would be a very simple statement that people would agree to, and then they would say, there's a symbol that they can put on, a link to something that says, I agree with this, and my art is made this way. And then that becomes viral, that becomes what people want to be associated with, and it becomes a public-facing statement. Somehow, I don't know what that looks like, and that would require consensus for us to actually define that, but I'm sure Arts Front's a lot of thinking on this already about what we stand for.
I can show you what we're currently doing, just as a set of tools as a starting point. So, and to let you know, this is kind of obviously all in development at the moment, but with our idea of launching something publicly and connecting with people in August next year, so August 2021, as kind of a time frame to put that stuff out. But some of those we're just experimenting with some of those tools at the moment. So we started with a First Peoples First kind of response that was simply people, you know, reporting on things like we did this morning about acknowledging country for the places that we're on in these conversations, as a way of kind of representing our support of, and, you know, trying to deliver on the Charter of Rights for Indigenous people and the Declaration of Rights for First Nations people. So I can show you that quickly on a screen share if you want, or I can just send a link to it.
Maybe send us the link, Norm, because we've only got a few minutes left here.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thanks. Pippa.
No, I was just going to say, because we only do have 9 minutes left, and this conversation has flowed beautifully, so we didn't want to interrupt it. And I guess it's really to consider whether this, there's been all sorts of people who've come in and out of these 4 conversations. We started it as a very emergent and kind of experimental space for us to just see what the appetite was, who would show up. Arts Front have been amazing to help us in order to do that. And I guess it's really what is useful moving forward. And we were also very keen that it be action-based because, as we've all said, there's a lot of conversations going on. So I guess it's really to reiterate that and see what the appetite is.
Norm, what about bringing together and making a kind of not too labor-intensive online conference of artists that are talking and thinking about these things already? Because there are a lot of artists that are, as I said, in small pockets in different places and spaces. What about bringing artists together in this forum online to talk about these things further? I mean, yeah, what do you think, Norm? I can help organize it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that's kind of really what we'll be putting on the table from Arts Front's point of view for the Arts Front 2030 work for next year. And so we'll be hoping to design like an EOI process that provides lots of opportunities. We're thinking like basically a month of programming that people pick up, basically as you guys have done, structure a set of conversations or actions that take place online, and then running them, and we just provide the support and back end to make that all happen. But as well as that, like, we'll be using it to finalize the launch of the Arts Front platform so that it's there for people to use independently beyond the kind of that time frame. So it will be great for us to be able to kind of work with this group to shape something up that, I think you've kind of brought a whole stack of new aspects to this conversation and a sharpness that hasn't been there in a lot of the other areas, and so that's playing, I think, a leadership role in terms of the broader thinking for some of the work that's happening in this space. And so that's a really critical thing, because there's obviously the bits and pieces that people will contribute to that broader program, but there's the overall kind of direction and curation of what its objectives are, which are really critical for us to have support and help with as well. And if we are moving ahead with this idea about the conversation about independence, so if people are interested in, imagine some folk in this group might be interested in being involved in that work, we're kind of loosely thinking about something that we're going to brand and call Independence Day, and kind of go out for kind of more high profile speakers and presenters to be, in a sense, leading the conversation as part of those broader sectors, and to kind of think through what an alliance between the public broadcasting and universities and arts and cultural sector and First Nation spaces might look like, and what the topic of independence could be. So that'll happen before the August gathering as a concrete thing, and if this group wants to continue to work on either that or something separate, or help with the overall shaping the Arts Front 2030 stuff, they're all kind of things that will be happening.
That sounds great, Norm. I just wanted to also make a comment. I think there you mentioned EOIs, and just something I wanted to put on the table. I think it's great to think about, especially when you're inviting artists, independent artists, and artists that are often disempowered, as we've said. When you're calling for EOIs, to avoid that problem of having the same voices and to not shut out the diverse voices, the way to do it is to have a mixture of EOIs and direct invitation.
Yes.
Because those people who've spent their entire career on the fringes, not because their work isn't good and they're not good, but because they don't have a platform or a voice because of the way that the sector is, they won't answer to EOIs. So I'd be happy to help with that.
And I was also going to say, and I put it in there, that the reason we started these conversations was that Gerkham and I connected on the fact that the structural change that's needed in the arts is so often missing from the conversation. And I have an eagle eye for structural, for how the structure then will play out. Because I think there's a whole lot of conversations that we just don't get into about class, about who's not in the room, or, you know, some of the things that Gherkin's talked about, inclusion, but it's not just about ethnicity and diversity in those ways. It's also about wealth. So and how do we, you know, recognize the great work that's going on and try and interrupt some of the hierarchical work that always goes on, because that feels very important, I think, if we're going to become more relevant to more people, which is, I think, an aim that everybody's articulated.
Shall we go around for the last 3 minutes with any final comments from people? Nancy, did you have anything you wanted to say?
No, not exactly, except that I would like to, you know, I guess I'll have to think myself. I have some specific actions that I'm doing through our company about diversity, specifically reaching out to First Nations people in a variety of different ways, and targeting with a program that we're hoping to do with Richmond, going out to various members of the community there and working with them, but again, not just blanket EOIs. Yeah, it's a new world. No, you go and always, Gherkin, I always want us to get back to because I'm desperate for infrastructure, desperate for it. Anyway, say la vie.
We're going to talk about organized chaos, Nancy. We're going to start that again. We're going to do it. And we're not going to go to the funding bodies. Or maybe we are.
Yeah, but they'll listen to us perhaps more now. Anyway, on to someone else.
Vivian, did you have any final comments?
I'm really excited. I think that it's great that there's these connections happening and these ideas are kind of emerging, because collectivism is the only way you get things done, really. And we have to obviously keep putting out the networks and keep building. Very happy to help in whichever way I can. Please use me. I'm not necessarily saying that all of my strengths, you know, I can cover everything at all. No, not at all. But my immediate actions, though, is that I do have something right in front of me, which is the campaign for the transition away from fossil fuel funding. That's my main focus for the next few months anyway. But within that frame, I think the broader conversations sit very nicely. So as I said, I see this as the easy step on the ladder. So I'm very happy to do what I can to build and move forward with this.
Thanks, Vivian. Excellent. Israel, did you have any final comments?
I'm looking forward to Independence Day. I'm all about liberation and emancipation of the artists. Yeah, thank you very much for this. I'm also excited about what's to come. Just a very quick comment that when we speak about discrimination yesterday in another context, when we spoke about diversity, suddenly this very old topic of parenting in the arts also came up, because people just said that they were not available to participate because they had children to take care of. And I've not heard that having to be said in years, because back in the days, we used to speak about how do you protect parents in the arts. And then now this is another thing. And who is the parent, and the female parent or the male parent, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of work to do. And yeah, thank you all for your generosity.
Thanks, Israel. Katie, did you have any final comments?
I'll try and make one without the sound effects in the background, because my dogs are about to have some sort of wild play fight that's slightly out of control. As you guys were speaking in the last round of really great comments, something came to my memory, which was a campaign that started probably early 2000s, which was an extra line on mostly like a bromide and an extra line on acknowledgements that artists would put on their exhibitions, which was artist funded. And so when we had a show, we would put that acknowledgement on to our exhibitions, as well as the City of Melbourne and all sorts of other things, because there's a perception, I think, that those grants cover the whole cost of a show, but a large part of what we produce is artist funded. And it was a really nice way of flipping the script, because it sort of put the power back into our own hands and acknowledged that that was a choice that we made to create and to contribute our finances towards the outcome of the show, and not to necessarily pass that all over in that infantilizing way to the funding bodies when they gave us $5,000 or something, you know. And so that was a really nice movement. It was started by Bianca Hester was really involved in it, but there was another woman whose name I can't recall who sort of started it, and it was something which we could, you know, look at. It was free access; everyone could take it and use it, and it got quite a lot of momentum at one stage. But it's an example, I suppose, of how you can sort of perhaps, I can't remember who was making the comment, but it sort of reminded me of the way that we can kind of mobilize, I guess, in a way to sort of create visual, to create some understanding, a kind of public awareness as well about what's funded and what's valuable. Yeah. So
that's a great final comment. Thanks, Katie. George. You don't have to, it's fine. Thanks for being here.
I think it's really good that, you know, I think it's actually amazing that, you know, that the paradigm is shifting, and that we are talking, you know, we're getting the razor out, and we're Occam's razor out, and we're, you know, really getting to the point. And yeah, viva la revolution, and thank you all for being so generous with what you're doing.
Thanks, George. And yes, Vivian said we need to document it, and this is all documented. Norm, did you have any final comments and a mention about how we're documenting these sessions?
Yeah, so all of this series is on Arts Front, and so great for people to maybe share with your colleagues and friends, and particularly I think kind of the kind of directional stuff that's coming out of today's conversation. I think it's important for people to know about it in particular, and any other conversations in the future will also be provided to you guys through Arts Front, so we'll kind of keep updates coming through your profiles and stuff. So, and thank you for particularly to Pippa and Gorkum for leading this conversation and the amazing work you guys do. Really great stuff.
Thank you, and thank you so much to you, Norm, and everyone else at Arts Front and Feral Arts. We absolutely value all of the work that you've done, and we obviously couldn't have done it without you. I just want to say thank you to everyone. It's been wonderful to be here. Pippa and I will be in touch. And Pippa, I'll hand over to you for final comments.
And yeah, I just also want to say thank you. It's been really great to be able to achieve these 4 and to feel some energy around this. So yeah, let's keep going. It's great. Have a great day and a great break.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Elliot.
Thanks,
Bye.
Elliot. Thanks, Louise and Ray.
Yes, thank you.